What if I told you that the feeling you've been carrying, that strange heaviness in your limbs when you wake in the morning, that sense that the world has somehow changed its rhythm without asking your permission, is not a sign that something is wrong with you, but rather the first whisper of something profoundly right beginning to unfold beneath the surface of your awareness? Most people, when they encounter this sensation, this slowing down of time, this thickness in the air between one moment and the next, immediately assume they've made a mistake somewhere. They look outward. They scan their circumstances, their relationships, their work, searching for the error, the malfunction, the thing that needs fixing. But what if the slowness itself is not the problem? What if it is, instead, the solution to a question you haven't yet learned to ask? There is a quality to certain seasons of life that defies explanation through the usual channels of understanding. You cannot point to a single event and say, "This is why everything feels different now." You cannot locate the source of the shift in any external change. Your routines remain largely the same. Your obligations continue. Your environment has not dramatically altered. And yet, something fundamental has changed. The pace at which you move through your days has become almost dreamlike. Tasks that once required no thought now demand a strange, deliberate attention. Conversations that used to energize you now leave you feeling as though you've traveled a great distance. Even your thoughts seem to arrive more slowly, as if they must pass through some invisible medium before reaching your conscious mind. This is not depression, though it may wear a similar face. This is not laziness, though the world may name it so. This is not avoidance, though you may find yourself stepping back from things that once seemed urgent. This is recalibration. This is the soul adjusting its instruments. This is the deep intelligence of your being recognizing that the tempo you've been maintaining, the speed at which you've been living, no longer serves the person you are becoming. And so, without asking permission from your ego, without consulting your plans or your expectations, something within you has reached out and gently touched the brakes. You feel in your body first, always. The way your feet seem heavier on the floor. The way your eyes want to close in the middle of the afternoon, not from exhaustion, but from something else, something that feels almost like a gentle insistence that you stop, that you pause, that you allow the world to continue without your constant participation for just a moment longer. You feel in the way time seems to stretch and compress unpredictably. An hour can feel like an entire day. A week can vanish in what seems like a single breath. You're no longer synchronized with the external clock. And this dissonance creates a kind of vertigo, a sense that you are somehow out of step with everyone around you. Carl Jung understood this territory well, though he approached it through the language of symbols and the unconscious rather than through the vocabulary of productivity and efficiency that dominates our current moment. He recognized that the psyche, that vast inner landscape we inhabit but rarely explore, has its own rhythms, its own seasons, its own necessary periods of dormancy and germination. He saw that what appears on the surface as a stagnation or regression is often, when viewed from a deeper vantage point, a gathering of forces, a consolidation of energy, a preparation for a transformation that has not yet announced itself to the conscious mind. Jung spoke of the self with a capital S, that center of wholeness that exists beyond the masks we wear, beyond the roles we play, beyond even our own understanding of who we think we are. And he observed that the journey toward this self, this deeper authenticity, is not a straight line of constant progress. It moves in spirals. It descends before it ascends. It requires periods of withdrawal, of silence, of what might look from the outside like nothing happening at all. But beneath that apparent stillness, beneath that frustrating slowness, entire continents of inner landscape are shifting, reforming, preparing to emerge into consciousness in forms you cannot yet imagine. In this exploration, I want to share with you 7 signs, 7 recognitions, 7 ways of seeing that might help you understand what is happening when everything in your life begins to feel slow, when the pace that once carried you forward now seems to resist your every effort. These are not instructions. They are not fixes. They are simply ways of naming what you may already be experiencing, ways of holding your current state with more compassion, more curiosity, more trust in the intelligence of your own unfolding. And I invite you to stay with me through all of them, because the last ones will reframe the first ones, and the whole picture only becomes visible when you allow yourself to see how each piece connects to every other piece. You may find, as we move through these together, that something you experienced last week, or last month, or even last year, suddenly makes sense in a way it didn't before. You may feel a kind of relief, a loosening in your chest, as you recognize that what you thought was your failure to keep up was actually your wisdom choosing to slow down. Nothing that happens in your inner life is random. Nothing that emerges from the depths of your being is a mistake. And if you've been feeling this slowness, this recalibration, it is because some part of you, some part that knows more than your conscious mind can access, has decided that now is the time for it. The first thing you might notice is that your old enthusiasms no longer grip you the way they once did. This is perhaps the most disorienting aspect of the recalibration, because we tend to identify so strongly with our interests, our passions, our pursuits. We tell ourselves stories about who we are based on what excites us, what motivates us, what we choose to do with our time and energy. And then one day, you wake up and the thing that used to light you up, that used to pull you out of bed with anticipation, feels flat. Not unpleasant, necessarily. Not actively distressing. Just flat. Neutral. Like food that has lost its flavor. You might try to force it at first. You might sit down to engage with your hobby, your creative practice, your social activities, and go through the motions with a kind of desperate hope that the feeling will return if you just push through. But it doesn't. The spark remains absent. And this absence begins to worry you. You wonder if you're losing yourself. You wonder if something fundamental has broken. You look at other people who seem so animated by their lives, so engaged with their pursuits, and you feel a distance opening up between you and them, a gap you don't know how to cross. But what if this loss of enthusiasm is not a loss at all? What if it is a release? Consider the possibility that the things you were enthusiastic about, the things that drove you forward with such intensity, were serving a version of you that no longer exists. They were appropriate for a particular stage of development, a particular set of needs, a particular understanding of what mattered. And now, as you stand on the threshold of something new, something that hasn't fully formed yet, those old enthusiasms have to fall away to make space for what wants to come next. Jung would call this a withdrawal of libido, that psychic energy that animates our engagement with the world. It sounds clinical, but the experience is deeply personal. The energy hasn't disappeared. It has simply pulled back from the external world and turned inward, where it is needed for the work of transformation. Think of a tree in autumn, drawing its sap back down into its roots, abandoning the leaves that have served their purpose. From the outside, it looks like dying. From the inside, it is preparation for survival, for the next season, for the new growth that will come when conditions are right. You might notice that during this time, you spend more time in reflection than in action. You might find yourself staring out windows, sitting in your car for a few extra minutes before going inside, lying in bed after you wake without any particular thoughts, just a kind of floating presence. This is not laziness. This is not wasting time. This is your psyche creating the space it needs to reorganize itself. The external world, with all its demands and distractions, has to recede for a while so that the internal world can come forward and do its work. The people around you may not understand this. They may ask if you're okay, if something's wrong, if you're depressed. And their concern, though well-intentioned, can make you doubt yourself even more, because you don't have a clear answer. You're not sure if you're okay or not. You're not sure if something's wrong, or if something's finally becoming right in a way you don't yet recognize. And so you might smile and say you're fine. You're just tired. You're just going through something, and you retreat further into the privacy of your own experience, where at least you don't have to explain what you yourself don't understand. But here's what's important to remember. The loss of old enthusiasms is not the end of enthusiasm itself. It is the clearing of the ground. It is the composting of what was, so that what will be has rich soil in which to take root. You cannot rush this process. You cannot think your way through it or force yourself back into the shape you used to be. You can only allow it. You can only notice it. You can only trust that the same intelligence that knew when to be enthusiastic also knows when to withdraw that enthusiasm, and that both movements are necessary, both sacred, both part of a larger pattern of becoming. The second sign that your soul is recalibrating the pace reveals itself in your relationship to time. You begin to experience what might be called temporal dissonance. The clock on the wall continues its steady march, but your internal sense of duration no longer matches it. You sit down to read for what feels like a few minutes, and an hour has passed. You work on a task that should take an hour, and it stretches into an entire afternoon. Not because you're distracted or inefficient, but because every action seems to require more presence, more attention, more time to complete than it used to. This can be maddening if you're still trying to operate according to your old metrics of productivity. You might find yourself constantly behind, constantly feeling like you're moving through molasses while everyone else glides past you with ease. You might start to judge yourself harshly, to question your competence, to wonder if you're somehow broken or diminished. But what if your experience of time is actually becoming more accurate, more aligned with the actual depth of each moment, rather than the shallow skimming across the surface that our culture mistakes for efficiency? There's a quality to real presence that cannot be rushed. When you truly inhabit a moment, when you allow yourself to feel the full weight and texture of what's happening right now, time expands. It has to, because presence is not about moving quickly through a series of events. It's about sinking deeply into the event that's actually occurring. And if your soul is recalibrating your pace, it may be teaching you, whether you want to learn it or not, how to stop rushing past your own life. You might notice this especially in conversations. Someone is talking to you, and you find yourself unable to respond as quickly as you used to. There's a lag, a space between their words and your reply, and in that space, you're actually absorbing what they said, feeling into it, considering it from multiple angles before you speak. This might make you feel slow, awkward, like you've lost your social fluency. But what if you've actually gained something more valuable? What if you've gained the ability to respond from a deeper place, rather than just reacting from the surface? Jung understood that the unconscious operates on a different timeline than the conscious mind. The ego wants everything now. It wants immediate results, instant clarity, rapid progress. But the self, that deeper center, works in cycles and seasons. It knows that some things must be incubated in darkness for a long time before they can emerge into the light. It knows that transformation cannot be scheduled or expedited. It knows that the soul has its own tempo, and that tempo is almost always slower than the pace our modern world demands. During this recalibration, you might also find that you need more time alone. Not because you're avoiding people, but because being around others requires an energy you don't currently have in abundance. Every interaction, even pleasant ones, seems to drain you more quickly than before. You need longer recovery periods between social engagements. You find yourself canceling plans not out of rudeness or disinterest, but out of a genuine need to preserve your energy for the internal work that's happening. This can create guilt. We live in a culture that values extroversion, connection, constant availability. Withdrawing, even temporarily, can feel like a failure of relationship, a betrayal of the people who care about you. But solitude, especially during periods of recalibration, is not rejection. It is protection. It is the soul creating a sacred container in which the work of reorganization can happen without interference, without the need to explain itself, without the distortion that comes from trying to maintain your old persona while your inner reality is shifting. You might find yourself drawn to activities that have a different quality of time embedded in them. Long walks where you're not going anywhere in particular. Sitting by water. Watching the sky change. These are not productive activities by conventional standards. They don't produce anything. They don't move you toward any goal. But they attune you to natural rhythms, to the pace at which the earth itself moves, which is so much slower and more cyclical than the linear, accelerated pace of human invention. There's a kind of healing that happens when you stop fighting your own tempo and start honoring it. When you stop apologizing for needing more time, more space, more silence. When you stop trying to speed yourself up to match a pace that was never sustainable in the first place. The recalibration of your relationship to time is not a problem to solve. It is an invitation to come home to a rhythm that is actually yours, rather than one you borrowed from a culture that has lost touch with the deeper patterns of growth and rest. The third sign emerges in your relationship to meaning and purpose. You may have spent years building your life around certain goals, certain definitions of success, certain visions of who you would become and what you would accomplish. And then, during this period of slowness, those meanings begin to loosen. The goals that once seemed so clear, so important, so worth sacrificing for, now seem arbitrary. Not wrong, necessarily, just arbitrary. Like rules to a game you no longer want to play. This can be terrifying. Purpose is supposed to be the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning, the thing that gives your life direction and coherence. When it starts to dissolve, you can feel unmoored, adrift in a vast ocean with no landmarks to navigate by. You might try to grip more tightly to the old purposes, to remind yourself why they mattered, to force yourself to care the way you used to. But the grip keeps slipping. The reasons that once seemed so solid now feel hollow, performative, like words you're saying because you think you should, not because they resonate with any truth inside you. Jung spoke about the difference between the persona and the self. The persona is the mask we wear, the role we play, the identity we construct to navigate the social world. It's not false exactly, but it's partial. It's the part of us that can be seen and understood by others. The self, on the other hand, is the totality of who we are, including all the parts that don't fit the mask, all the contradictions and complexities and depths that can't be easily categorized or explained. For much of life, we invest heavily in the persona. We build our sense of purpose around it. We define ourselves by our roles, our achievements, our place in the social hierarchy. And this works for a while. But there comes a time, often in the middle of life, but sometimes earlier or later, when the self begins to assert itself more strongly. It begins to demand recognition. It begins to insist that the persona, no matter how successful or well-constructed, is not the whole story. And this insistence often manifests as a loss of meaning in the things that used to define us. You might find yourself asking questions you never asked before. What is this all for? Why am I doing this? What do I actually want, as opposed to what I think I should want? These questions don't have easy answers. In fact, they're not really meant to be answered quickly. They're meant to be lived with, sat with, allowed to work on you over time. They're the soul's way of creating space for a deeper purpose to emerge, one that's more aligned with who you actually are rather than who you thought you needed to be. During this time, you might feel a kind of purposelessness that's both uncomfortable and strangely liberating. Without the old meanings to organize your days, you're forced to confront the raw fact of your existence, the simple reality of being alive without any particular story about what that's supposed to mean. This can feel like falling, like losing your grip on something essential, but it can also feel like a release, like putting down a heavy burden you didn't realize you were carrying. The recalibration of meaning is not about finding a new purpose to replace the old one. It's about learning to hold purpose more lightly, to recognize that meaning is not something fixed and permanent, but something that shifts and evolves as you shift and evolve. What mattered deeply at one stage of life may matter less at another, not because you've failed or regressed, but because you've grown into a different relationship with yourself and the world. You might notice that during this period, you're drawn to questions rather than answers. You might find yourself reading philosophy or poetry, or sitting with spiritual texts not for instruction, but for companionship in the uncertainty. You might have conversations that don't resolve anything, but somehow feel important anyway, like you're mapping territory that has no clear boundaries or destinations. This is the soul doing its work, expanding the space of what's possible, refusing to settle back into the old categories too quickly. There's a temptation, especially in a culture that pathologizes uncertainty, to rush this process, to grab onto a new purpose before the old one has fully composted, to find a new identity before you've fully released the previous one. But the recalibration requires the gap. It requires the time of not knowing. It requires the willingness to be purposeless for a while, to let the old meanings die without immediately resurrecting them in a new form. This gap, this void, this fertile emptiness is where the real transformation happens. The fourth sign shows up in your body, in the physical sensations that accompany this slowing down. You might feel heavier, denser, as if gravity has increased its pull on you. Getting out of bed requires more effort. Moving through your day requires more rest. Your body seems to be insisting on a different pace, and no amount of caffeine or willpower can override it for long. This is not illness, though it may make you worry about your health. This is the body's wisdom, asserting itself in the face of a mind that has been pushing too hard for too long. The body doesn't lie. It can't perform enthusiasm it doesn't feel. It can't pretend to have energy it doesn't possess. And during a recalibration, the body often becomes the most honest indicator of what's actually happening beneath the surface. Your mind might still be trying to maintain the old pace, still generating lists and plans and obligations. But your body simply refuses. It moves more slowly. It demands more rest. It creates symptoms, sometimes subtle and sometimes dramatic, that force you to stop, to pause, to pay attention. You might experience this as fatigue, but it's a particular kind of fatigue, not the exhaustion that comes from overwork, though that may be part of it. This is a tiredness that sleep doesn't fully resolve. You wake up after 8 hours and still feel like you need to lie back down. You rest, and the rest doesn't seem to replenish you the way it used to. This is because the fatigue is not just physical, it's existential. It's the tiredness that comes from living out of alignment with your deeper self, from maintaining a pace that your soul has outgrown. Jung recognized the body as a carrier of unconscious content. The symptoms we experience, the sensations that arise, are not just random physiological events. They're communications from the depths, messages in a language we've forgotten how to read. When the body slows down, when it becomes heavy and resistant, it may be trying to tell you something that your conscious mind hasn't yet grasped. It may be saying, stop, rest, turn inward, pay attention to what's happening beneath the surface. During this time, you might find that your relationship to physical activity changes. Exercise that used to energize you now depletes you. Or perhaps the opposite happens. Perhaps you find yourself craving movement in a new way, not as performance or achievement, but as a way of being present in your body, of feeling yourself inhabit your own skin. You might be drawn to gentler forms of movement, walking instead of running, stretching instead of pushing, activities that honor the pace your body is asking for rather than the pace your mind thinks you should maintain. There's often resistance to this. We live in a culture that worships productivity, that treats the body as a machine that should perform consistently regardless of what's happening internally. When your body refuses to cooperate with this expectation, you might judge yourself harshly. You might think you're out of shape, lazy, losing your edge. But what if your body is actually becoming more intelligent, more attuned to its own needs, more willing to prioritize depth over speed, sustainability over intensity? You might also notice changes in your appetite, your sleep patterns, your sensory sensitivities. Foods that used to satisfy you no longer appeal. You need more quiet, more darkness, more softness. Loud environments that you could tolerate before now feel overwhelming. Your nervous system seems to be recalibrating its thresholds, becoming more selective about what it allows in, more protective of your inner space. This is not weakness. This is discernment. This is your body learning to guard the energy you need for the transformation that's unfolding. The body's slowness is not something to overcome. It's something to listen to honor, to follow. When you stop fighting it and start cooperating with it, you often discover that the body has been trying to guide you all along, trying to lead you back to a pace that's actually sustainable, actually nourishing, actually aligned with the rhythms of growth and rest that govern all living things. The recalibration happens in the flesh as much as in the psyche, and the two are not separate, but intimately intertwined. The fifth sign appears in your relationship to other people. You may find that friendships and connections that once felt vital now feel draining or simply irrelevant. This is not because you've become antisocial or because those people have done anything wrong. It's because the recalibration of your inner world naturally shifts your resonance with the outer world. You begin to notice that certain conversations, certain social dynamics, certain ways of relating no longer match the frequency you're operating on. And maintaining those connections starts to feel like work, like translation, like you're constantly having to explain yourself or pretend to be someone you're no longer sure you are. This can bring up guilt and confusion. We're taught that relationships are about loyalty, consistency, showing up regardless of how we feel. And there's truth in that, to a point. But there's also a deeper truth that as we change, as we grow, as we move through different phases of our inner development, our relational needs change too. The people who were perfect companions at one stage may not be the right companions for the next stage. And recognizing this, allowing it, doesn't make you a bad friend or a disloyal person. It makes you honest. You might find yourself withdrawing from group activities, from social media, from the constant chatter and exchange that used to feel connecting but now feels fragmenting. You might prefer one-on-one conversations, or even no conversations at all, just quiet parallel presence. You might discover that you can only be around people who are comfortable with silence, who don't need you to perform or explain or fill the space with words. This selectivity is not snobbery. It's self-preservation. It's the soul protecting the delicate work that's happening inside you from the interference of energies that don't understand or support it. Jung understood that individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, often requires a period of separation from the collective. The collective has its own values, its own pace, its own expectations, and those expectations can be so loud, so insistent, that they drown out the quieter voice of your own inner truth. To hear that voice, to follow it, you sometimes have to step back from the crowd, to risk being misunderstood or judged, to prioritize your inner alignment over your outer belonging. This doesn't mean you become a hermit forever. It doesn't mean you reject all relationships or decide that people are the problem. It means you enter a phase where your primary relationship is with yourself, with your own depths, with a process of transformation that's unfolding. And from that place of deeper self-connection, new relationships will eventually emerge, relationships that are based on who you're actually becoming rather than who you used to be. You might notice that the people who remain close to you during this time are the ones who can tolerate your slowness, your uncertainty, your withdrawal. They're the ones who don't need you to be anything other than what you are right now. They're the ones who can sit with you in silence, who can accept your need for space without taking it personally, who trust that you're going through something important even if you can't articulate what it is. These relationships become more precious, more real, because they're not based on performance or persona, but on genuine presence. There's also the possibility that you'll feel lonely during this recalibration. Not because you're alone, necessarily, but because you're between worlds. You've left behind the way you used to connect, but you haven't fully arrived at the new way yet. You're in the liminal space, the threshold, and it can feel isolating. But this loneliness, uncomfortable as it is also generative. It's teaching you to be your own companion, to find resources within yourself that you didn't know you had, to stop looking outside for validation or completion and start building a relationship with your own depths. The recalibration of your social world is not about becoming less connected. It's about becoming more discerning. It's about learning to recognize which connections nourish you and which ones deplete you, which relationships support your growth, and which ones keep you locked in old patterns. And it's about having the courage to honor what you discover, even when it means disappointing people, even when it means being misunderstood, even when it means spending more time alone than you ever thought you would. The sixth sign reveals itself in your relationship to your own thoughts and inner dialogue. You may notice that the constant mental chatter that used to fill your mind begins to quiet, not all at once, and not permanently, but in moments, in pockets of unexpected stillness. You might be doing something ordinary, washing dishes or driving, and suddenly realize that you haven't been thinking about anything at all. You've just been present, just been there, without the usual narrative running in the background. This can be startling. We're so accustomed to the voice in our head that its absence can feel strange, even slightly alarming. But this quieting of the mind is one of the gifts of the recalibration. When the soul slows down the pace, when it withdraws energy from external pursuits and internal anxieties, it creates space for a different kind of awareness to emerge. Not the awareness that thinks and plans and worries, but the awareness that simply observes, that notices, that is present without needing to do anything with that presence. This is the awareness that Jung might have called the self observing the ego, the deeper center watching the surface activity with compassion and detachment. You might find that your relationship to your own thoughts becomes less identified, less automatic. A thought arises, and instead of immediately believing it or following it down its familiar path, you notice it. You see it as a thought, as a mental event, rather than as truth or reality. This creates a kind of spaciousness, a gap between the thought and your response to it. And in that gap, you have more freedom. You can choose whether to engage with the thought or let it pass. You can question its validity rather than assuming it's reporting accurate information about yourself or the world. This shift can be subtle, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. But over time, you may notice that you're less at the mercy of your own mind. The anxious thoughts still come, but they don't grip you the way they used to. The self-critical voice still speaks, but you don't automatically believe everything it says. The plans and worries and regrets still arise, but they don't consume you. You're learning to be the space in which thoughts appear and disappear, rather than being the thoughts themselves. There's a quality of rest that comes with this. Not the rest of sleep, but the rest of not having to constantly manage your own mind. When you're no longer fighting with your thoughts, no longer trying to control them, or make them go away, or force them into positivity, you can simply let them be. You can watch them the way you might watch clouds moving across the sky. Interesting but not personal, present but not permanent. This is a profound shift in your relationship to yourself, and it's one of the ways the soul recalibrates your pace. It slows you down enough that you can finally see the machinery of your own mind, and in seeing it, you become less entangled with it. You might also notice that during this time, your intuition becomes stronger, clearer, more accessible. This is because intuition doesn't speak in the language of constant mental chatter. It speaks in the language of feeling, of knowing, of subtle inner shifts that can only be heard when the noise quiets down. When your mind is always busy, always planning, always analyzing, there's no space for intuition to make itself known. But when the pace slows, when the chatter diminishes, you start to hear the quieter voice that has been there all along, waiting for you to listen. This intuitive knowing doesn't announce itself loudly. It's not dramatic or forceful. It's more like a gentle pull, a sense of rightness or wrongness that you can't quite explain, but that you learn to trust. You might find yourself making decisions differently during this time, not based on logic or pros and cons lists, but based on a felt sense of what aligns with something deeper in you. This can be unsettling if you're used to relying on rational analysis, but can also be liberating. It can reconnect you with a kind of intelligence that's older and wiser than your conscious mind, an intelligence that knows things your ego hasn't figured out yet. The recalibration of your inner dialogue is not about achieving some perfect state of mental silence or enlightenment. It's about developing a different relationship with your own mind, one that's more spacious, more compassionate, more aware. It's about recognizing that you're not your thoughts, that there's something in you that observes the thoughts, and that something is more essentially you than any particular thought could ever be. This recognition doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds gradually, in moments, in glimpses, in the slow accumulation of instances where you catch yourself being aware of awareness itself. The seventh sign, and perhaps the most subtle, appears in your relationship to control and certainty. You may find that your need to know what's going to happen, to have a plan, to feel secure in your understanding of the future, begins to loosen. Not because you've become reckless or indifferent, but because you're beginning to recognize that control was always an illusion, and that the energy you've been spending trying to maintain that illusion is energy you need for other things. During the recalibration, the soul teaches you, slowly and sometimes painfully, how to live with uncertainty, how to tolerate not knowing, how to move forward even when the path ahead is unclear. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the slowing down, because our culture offers us so few models for how to be with uncertainty. We're taught to plan, to prepare, to anticipate, to eliminate risk. We're taught that not knowing is a problem to be solved as quickly as possible. But the recalibration asks something different of you. It asks you to sit in the not knowing, to let the uncertainty be there without rushing to resolve it, to trust that clarity will come when it's ready and not a moment before. You might notice that during this time, you make fewer plans, not because you don't care about the future, but because you're learning to hold the future more lightly. You might find yourself saying, "I don't know," more often, and meaning it, and being okay with meaning it. You might discover that you can tolerate ambiguity in ways you couldn't before, that you can live with unanswered questions, that you can move through your days without needing to have everything figured out. Jung spoke of the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to hold opposing forces in tension until something new emerges. This is not about choosing between certainty and uncertainty, control and surrender. It's about learning to hold both, to recognize that you can take action without needing to control the outcome, that you can make choices without needing to know for certain that they're the right choices. This capacity to hold paradox, to tolerate ambiguity, is a mark of psychological maturity, and it's one of the gifts that emerges from the recalibration. You might find that your relationship to mistakes and failure changes during this time. When you're not gripping so tightly to control, when you're not so invested in having everything figured out, mistakes become less catastrophic. They become information, feedback, part of the process rather than evidence of your inadequacy. You might find yourself more willing to experiment, to try things without knowing how they'll turn out, to follow curiosity rather than certainty. This shift can feel like losing your footing, like you're walking on ground that's less solid than it used to be. But it can also feel like a kind of freedom, like you've put down a burden you didn't realize was optional. The need for certainty is exhausting. It requires constant vigilance, constant effort, constant management of variables that are ultimately beyond your control. When you begin to release that need, when you allow yourself to not know, to not be sure, to not have it all figured out, you free up enormous amounts of energy that can be redirected toward actually living your life rather than trying to control it. The recalibration of your relationship to control and certainty is not about becoming passive or resigned. It's about becoming more fluid, more responsive, more able to adapt to what actually is rather than what you think should be. It's about developing a kind of trust, not in any particular outcome, but in your own capacity to meet whatever comes, to learn from it, to grow through it, to find your way even when the map is unclear. As we come to the end of this exploration, I want to invite you to step back and see all of these signs not as separate symptoms, but as different expressions of a single process. The loss of old enthusiasms, the distortion of time, the dissolution of meaning, the body's resistance, the shifting of relationships, the quieting of the mind, the release of control. These are all threads in the same tapestry. They're all ways that the soul slows you down, pulls you inward, creates the conditions necessary for a transformation that cannot happen at the pace you've been living. Nothing that's happening to you is random. Nothing is a mistake. The slowness you're experiencing is not a malfunction. It's a recalibration. It's your being's way of saying that the tempo you've been maintaining, the speed at which you've been moving through your life, no longer serves the person you're becoming. And so, with a wisdom that operates beneath the level of your conscious awareness, something in you has reached out and gently, firmly, insistently touched the brakes. This process cannot be rushed. You cannot think your way through it or force yourself back to the pace you used to maintain. You can only allow it. You can only notice it. You can only meet it with as much compassion and curiosity as you can muster in any given moment. And in allowing it, in not fighting it, in trusting that there's an intelligence at work that knows more than your ego can access, you create the space for something new to emerge. The recalibration is not the end of your story. It's the pause between chapters, the breath between notes, the space where one version of you completes and another begins to take form. What comes after will surprise you. It will not look like what you planned or expected. It will be more aligned with your truth, more authentic to who you actually are beneath all the roles and masks and expectations. But you cannot skip to that part. You have to be here in the slowness, in the uncertainty, in the not knowing, for as long as it takes. If you're in this process right now, if everything feels slow and heavy and unclear, I want you to know that you're not broken. You're not failing. You're not falling behind. You're exactly where you need to be. Your soul is doing its work. Your depths are reorganizing. Your inner landscape is shifting in ways that will eventually become visible on the surface, but not yet. Not until the process is complete. What can you do while you're in this space? Very little, and that's the point. You can notice. You can observe. You can be gentle with yourself. You can stop judging the slowness and start honoring it. You can create space for rest, for silence, for solitude. You can stop trying to force yourself back into the shape you used to be and start getting curious about the shape that's trying to emerge. You might keep a journal, not to analyze or figure things out, but simply to witness your own process, to mark the small shifts that are easy to miss in the day-to-day. You might spend time in nature, where the rhythms are slower and more cyclical, where the trees and the seasons can remind you that growth is not linear. That dormancy is as necessary as blooming. You might sit in silence, even for just a few minutes a day, and practice being with yourself without needing to do anything, fix anything, or become anything. The recalibration will complete itself when it's ready. You'll know because you'll feel it. The heaviness will lift. The pace will quicken, but in a different way, a more sustainable way, a way that's aligned with who you've become rather than who you used to be. The enthusiasm will return, but for different things, truer things, things that resonate with the deeper layers of yourself that have been revealed in the slowness. The meaning will reconstitute itself, but it will be a meaning you've discovered rather than one you've inherited or constructed to please others. Until then, be patient with yourself. Be kind to the slowness. Trust the process, even when you can't see where it's leading. Remember that the soul has its own intelligence, its own timing, its own reasons for doing what it does. And remember that nothing, absolutely nothing, that emerges from your depths is a mistake. If this exploration has resonated with something in you, if you've recognized yourself in these signs, I invite you to leave a comment sharing your experience. Not to explain or justify, but simply to witness your own process in words, to make it real by naming it. And if you've found value in this reflection, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, because there's more to explore, more to understand, more to recognize about the deep patterns that shape our inner lives. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for trusting your own slowness enough to stay until the end.